All right, welcome back. A new drug threat assessment coming out just as the state of California could be the first in our nation to fully legalize marijuana. The combination setting the pot debate ablaze in this country. Forgive me the pun. This week, a proposal to control and tax marijuana qualified for California's November general election ballot. It's called the Regulate, Control, and Tax Cannabis Act. It would overturn the almost century-long prohibition on the drug. It would also allow people over the age of 21 to possess, or it would allow people over 21 to possess, cultivate, or transport pot for personal use, and permit local governments to regulate, and most importantly, if you're in California, tax the drug. Smoking marijuana in public or driving under the influence would remain illegal. Plan proponents say it would raise $1.4 billion for the cash-strapped state. They argue it is in line with Americans' changing view of the specific drug. The most recent Gallup poll on marijuana shows a record high 44% of Americans now support its legalization. That is a 10 percentage point jump since just 2001. You may not know this, but the United States is the world's largest consumer of marijuana. 26 million Americans using pot in 2008 alone. That's about 1 in 10 Americans. It's already California's most lucrative cash crop. Providing the counter-narrative, however, law enforcement officials who say legalizing marijuana could spur an increase in crime, and other anti-drug activists who fear a general denigration of society. But let's give this state debate some broader context. It's not just California. Let's talk about Mexico, America, and the drug connection. New this week, the National Drug Threat Assessment by the Department of Justice, which found Mexican drug cartels ramping up production in their country, while increasing the flow of meth, heroin, and yes, pot into our country. Quite simply, it means Mexico gets the violence and Americans buy the drugs. More than 18,000 people in violent death in Mexico since the government there declared their war on drugs 3 years ago. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in Mexico just this week, offering a recommitment to help Mexico fight the drug cartels with an additional $1.4 billion in aid. We should point out that the drug cartels net $25 billion a year in criminal earnings, and 60% of those profits come from, you guessed it, marijuana. So between the multi-billion-dollar cost of fighting a war on drugs, billions more spent to incarcerate those who are caught, and a stunning and violent body count, not to mention, perhaps most importantly, the potential political destabilization and development of a narco state on the U.S. southern border with Mexico, who is our most important, or one of our two most important trading partners, along with Canada. What is the solution for a problem that has, for so many, no good answers, but it certainly has tremendous and increasing costs? Joining us now, General Barry McCaffrey, former U.S. drug czar and MSNBC military analyst, and Paul Armentano, Deputy Director of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Paul, I guess I will begin with you. What do you find is the most compelling argument that you can offer as to why voting yes on a ballot like this fall would be a good idea?
Well, look, we've got 18,000 dead since 2006 in Mexico because of U.S. drug policies, particularly the policies pertaining to the use and trafficking of marijuana. You said in your opening monologue, 60% or over 60% of the profits that the cartels make come from the exportation of marijuana from Mexico to the United States. To continue the same policies we've been going on all these years is the very definition of insanity. It is time to take the production and distribution of marijuana away from these violent cartels and put it into the hands of licensed businesses. The way we do that is through legalization and through regulation. The prohibition that we have now is anarchy. Regulation would bring needed controls to this market.
Barry, are you there?
Yeah.
I want to ask you about some of the numbers. They argue that legalization and taxation would save $7.7 billion in enforcement, $6.2 billion in incarceration costs, and generate between $2 and $6 billion in tax revenues, depending on how it was taxed. You yourself, in the McCaffrey report, basically, it wrote, and I'll quote you, Mexico is on the edge of the abyss. It could become a narco state in the coming decade. And then you go on to talk about the extraordinary nature of the military equipment that these people have. Now, I'm not saying that all of this is an argument for legalization. I'm wondering if there is another solution other than the current plan, which yields the amount of violence that it does and everything that we've just discussed, that is not legalization, but is also not this, that you would consider.
Yeah. Well, Dylan, look, I think a lot of the numbers that we're being touted about are nonsense. The problem with Mexico has everything to do with violent criminal gangs involved in the distribution of illegal drugs, growing rates of addiction in Mexico, decreasing rates of addiction, thank God, in the United States, to include drunk driving, you name it. I think this California proposition, by the way, which will have nothing to do with changing federal law or international treaty, what it will do, undoubtedly, is create an incredible situation where California truck drivers and eye surgeons and, teachers, in theory, could be smoking pot standing around the corner from students or their jobs. It doesn't make any sense. Or airline pilots. So I don't think it's going to pass, I hope. Mothers Against Drunk Driving is against it. The Law Enforcement Committee, Governor candidate Jerry Brown's against it. America's families shouldn't support this kind of thinking.
How do you address the violence in Mexico, which, again, those who would argue for legalization as an unwelcome but preferable alternative to the current environment, is the only way they see to reduce the violence? You talk about the narco state, 60% of their trafficking is marijuana. If it was regulated and taxed, wouldn't that implicitly reduce the level of violence and increase the level of stability? And then you could, and this is the theory, you could then tax marijuana and use that money to fund anti-marijuana ads.
There isn't one shred of evidence that if you, for example, cigarettes, which kills 440,000 people a year in America, that taxing cigarettes even begins to yield a payoff for the damage it does. And again, the problem in Mexico is this brave President Calderon trying to create federal law enforcement that's adequate, trained, equipped to enforce the rule of law. Mexican families don't want heroin addiction, cocaine addiction, methamphetamines as part of their culture. So, I mean, we could legalize bank robbery.
I understand, but there are those who argue, and let's set everything except for marijuana aside, only because that is the piece of legislation that's being discussed, and it is distinctly a different drug than the other ones you were referencing. And at the end of the day, is it too convenient for American politicians and others to say, listen, the moral high ground is to leave this drug illegal and ignore the fact that it is a prohibition on that drug is creating the environment that generates the violence that you speak of, that the solution to the violence is regulation and taxation?
Dylan, I would not accept the premise that the legalization of marijuana will reduce the incentive on Mexican drug criminal organizations to ship illegal drugs across their own territory and use them in Mexico. That doesn't make much sense. The problem with drugs, and it's not just marijuana. By the way, marijuana, ecstasy, and beer are the principal threats to 6th graders through 12th graders. That's a drug we worry most about in drug prevention. Sure. But when it comes back to drugs...
and that drug is illegal.
Hold on, Paul, Hold on, Paul, I'm coming to you. Go ahead, General.
When it comes to these illegal drugs in Mexico, again, the struggle is, how does Mexico create the rule of law with honest, dedicated, equipped federal police officers? That's the struggle at hand, and you don't do away with that by legalizing the product they're moving. And by the way, if we did legalize drugs in California, marijuana as an example, why would anybody pay $50 an ounce for the tax in California when they could still get it from Mexican criminal organizations?
Paul, what were you going to say, and how do you respond to the question the General just asked?
Well, the General is bringing up societal costs that he associates with the use of marijuana. But right now, as you said in your opening, 1 out of 10 Americans are using marijuana. They're doing it despite prohibition. And society is not bringing in any revenue or any tax from that use to cover these ancillary costs that we know are far less than the costs associated with alcohol and tobacco. That's